All right, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be updating the power rankings for Australian Survivor Blood versus Water following week 2 or episode 6. And this was a pretty fun week for the show. Now, admittedly, the actual eliminations, I felt like not too much progress was made on those with a non elimination episode and a quit. And there was one interesting vote, but aside from that, like this week didn't feel like it moved the needle too much, although we did get some more content from some more people. But obviously, we have 21 people to rank based on their likelihood to win the game. So let's just jump right in. So, starting off the list at number 21, we have one of the boots from this week. We have Alex. And despite him being eliminated this week, he didn't get too much content. I mean, he got no content in episode 4. In episode 5, his boot episode, we only get a brief confessional of him before a tribal where he talks more about his back injury following the immunity challenge. And he talks about how he feels like his tribe is impressed by his effort. However, obviously, we get the tribal where he talks about how it's become too much for him, and through that, he quits the game. Now, while its decision to quit appears like another blindside after so much screen time was dedicated to Sophie and the potential con blindside, I noticed that Alex's edit in this episode is pretty similar to Kate's edit in her boot episode, where both of them were largely invisible outside of a random confessional they got immediately after the immunity challenge. So if something like this happens again, hopefully I won't be as surprised, but that's just a little pattern I noticed. But overall, Alex was never that much of a factor in the game or in the edit. I think a lot of that came from him being injured, which harmed his ability to contribute much to the tribe. And I feel like the editors just didn't really want him on the show that much considering he quit the game. But even beyond that, while he was shown being involved in some of the game talks, he didn't seem that well positioned on his tribe, and while he wasn't being targeted in the round that he left, I don't see how he would have played much of a factor beyond that point. I don't really see how he would have won the game. And I know that I had him ranked number 2 in my preseason, and to an extent I still stand by that. Like I feel like he definitely has the game knowledge to where had he stuck around he could have integrated better. But obviously his back injury really got in the way of that, and even beyond that, he didn't seem super well in the swing of things. So because of that, I have him here at number 21. Now moving on to number 20, we have the other boot from this week, and it's actually Alex's partner. We have Jay. And Jay got a bit more content than Alex this week, although I still wouldn't consider it that much. I mean, in episode 4, we learn that he's working with Amy, or more specifically, Amy talks about working with him. She also talks to him about saving David and blindsiding Sophie, which he's open to. And then obviously, he's a part of that plan. In episode 5, Sam says Jay is a part of her alliance. And we also hear him say that the other alliance of the alpha males is pretty shaky after the Sophie blindside. And obviously, by the end of the episode, he's the third person to lose his partner in Alex. And then in episode 6, his boot episode, doesn't really get too much screen time. I mean, he definitely does, but he's definitely not the focus either. Where obviously there's talk about Sandra breaking up the trio of him, Amy, and David, starting with David before targeting him. And, he talks to Ben about targeting Sandra. And before Tribal, he's shown talking to Croc that they'll let each other know that they're in trouble, which was probably a bit of foreshadowing that he would be blindsided here. In the end, while Amy does play the idol on herself, obviously Sandra splits the votes, and he through that he sniped out of the game. And overall, it's kind of funny how he went out right after his partner, considering obviously this is part of the pattern this season with Kate going out soon after Andy and even David being in a good amount of danger since Brianna was voted out. Kind of goes to show how these players are approaching the blood versus water format differently from the US versions, where obviously in the US versions, we saw the people that lost their partners early end up aligning together and through that being able to run the game. Where obviously in Blood versus Water, we saw that with Tyson and Jervis. And in San Juan del Sur, we saw this with Natalie and Jeremy. Obviously, ended up being major figures on that season, despite losing their partners early. However, on this season, it seems sort of the opposite, where people are viewing people that lose their partners early as easy targets, and that it's really easy to vote them out without angering their partner who's on the other tribe. So it's sort of weird how they're approaching it that way. What about Jay? I mean, he was largely quiet in the edit. I mean, while we learned more about his position this week, where we saw him in that alliance with Amy and David, he was far from the most prominent figure in that group, even in his boot episode. Gameplay wise, I thought it was all right early on. He was in the majority for those first few tribals, voting against David and Sophie. Along the way, we learned that he was close to Amy and David, which I just mentioned. And of those three, Jay did the least wrong to be voted out, as we saw David sort of blow up his game in episode 3. And obviously, even in this episode, he was initially Sandra's target, while Amy was obviously the one to put herself out there with putting the Sandra blindside together. She was the one to find the idol. And obviously, when it came down to it, like Sandra's group split the vote between her and Jay, so it was going to be one of them. Jay just happened to be targeted as he was least likely to have the idol played on, and obviously that ended up being correct as they put 4 votes on him. When the idol was played on Amy, he went out as a result. So not too much to say here. I mean, like I said, I felt like he did all right in the game, but obviously with him being an early boot, not ideal. So he's here at number 20. So with that, we now have 19 people left in the game, and it is time to rank them based on how likely I think it is that they'll win the game. But at number 19, we have the person I think is the least likely to do so, and here we have Mel. Now, it was actually a debate for me between Mel and the next person we'll be talking about, as it's kind of funny, as I feel like a lot of the people that did not get any content, or at least didn't get much content in the first week, generally got more this week, or at least we learned more about their game position. And obviously, we'll be talking about those people later. However, Mel is someone we know nothing about even after this week. I mean, she was incredibly invisible in week 1, learned very little about her position there, and this week is largely the same. I mean, no content in episode 4. Episode 5, we see her reunite with Michelle, and then no content in episode 6 either. So, literally, the only thing meaningful we get from her this week is during the reward challenge in episode 5. But even then, like, it's not really focused on at all. I mean, it seems like we just get that shot of them getting back together, but nothing really comes out of it. And through that, I feel like the show isn't really invested in her. Now, mind you, I think she'll probably do decently well. I don't think she'll leave the next boot or anything. However, the fact that we are now 6 episodes in and know nothing about Mel at all, whereas we know a little bit more about Michelle, is a big reason I have her here at number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and we have someone pretty similar to Mel, although we know a little bit more about their game. And here we have Josh. Again, who is Josh? Again, no content really in week 1, and then even in week 2, we don't get too much from him. I mean, in episode 4, we hear Khan say he's close to him. Mark also talks to him about flushing Khan's idol, and he agrees that Khan is dangerous. In episode 5, Sam tells him during the reward that he should target Sophie, and he agrees. And in episode 6, Khan talks to him and Jordy about targeting Sophie. That's pretty much the extent of his content this week. And, to be fair, it's a little bit more than what we got from Mel. But again, considering we got nothing from him in week 1, this just doesn't cut it. Like, I still feel like I know nothing about Josh as a person. Mind you, we do get some more insight into his relationships, and that's something, I guess. But again, Josh is someone I've ruled out. I don't think he really has much of a shot of winning. And because of that, I have him here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and believe it or not, we're already wrapping up one of the pairs, and here we have Michelle. Again, Michelle's not winning this game either. Obviously, the reason I have her above Mel is that we at least know more about her position in the game. And again, while she gets some content exploring that, I mean, I don't think it's a particularly great position. I mean, obviously, in episode 4, Sandra tells her about blindsiding Sophie, and she seems to agree. In episode 5, Sam says she's in her alliance. At the reward, we see her reunite with Mel. And in episode 6, obviously, she has a pretty big role where she talks to Sandra and Sam about the next vote, targeting Dave, and observing the Amy J. David trio. Then after the challenge, she's the one to talk to Sandra and Sam about targeting David. And then later on, she even gets a confessional about how Sandra is someone she can learn from. Particularly, she learned that if someone finds an idol, they should keep it to themselves. And then obviously, Michelle was the one to see Amy find the idol, which she reports to Sandra, which of course causes Sandra to create the split vote plan, which ultimately goes through. But overall, I'm not feeling too great about Michelle. I mean, to her credit, like we learn that she is very closely aligned with Sandra. And obviously, that is something. I mean, obviously, that's something that has allowed her to do relatively well up to this point. However, I feel like it's something that'll probably only hurt her game moving forward. I feel like, again, Sandra's not winning the game, and we'll be talking about her later. But I feel like through that, the show may also punish the people that are loyal to Sandra right now. Like may present them as people that, yeah, they're learning about the game, but they're associating themselves with Sandra to the point that they're making themselves a target. And I feel like that fate will happen to Michelle, where she'll either be swapped onto the same tribe as Sandra and through that be looked at as her lackey, or maybe move on to another tribe where like she'll probably not get that much screen time as all of her screen time has been dedicated to Sandra. Admittedly, the learning arc could be beneficial for them moving forward. However, I'm not getting too great of a sense. I feel like the people that we are seeing being closely aligned to Sandra and people that are basing their game around Sandra will be people who ultimately get taken out, like because of their association to Sandra at some point. So, because of that, I have Michelle here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and we have someone kind of similar to Michelle in that they've expressed loyalty to Sandra. However, they have a bit more going on beyond that, and here we have Ben. And this week was okay for Ben. I mean, in episode 4, he has a confessional about winning the reward challenge. We see him reunite with Shael. Like when Shael goes over to the other tribe, Sophie says she's very close to him. After Shael leaves, he talks to Sophie about the core of them, Croc and Jordan. He and his alliance agreed to target David. However, they're ultimately blindsided at the tribal. In episode 5, he talks to Croc and Jordan about the previous vote. At the reward, we see him reunite with Shael. I thought that was pretty significant. He gets a confessional talking about not getting to eat the reward while they have to watch the Water Tribe enjoy it. In episode 6, Jay talks to him about targeting Sandra. Afterward, Jordan, and Croc talk about their options. And of course, they ultimately stick with Sandra's split vote plan at the tribal, vote out Jay. Overall, Ben has had a moderate presence in the edit, and to be fair, I no longer think he'll be an early boot necessarily. Like, obviously, I was talking a bit about that last week. I think he has a bit more longevity now, considering that gameplay wise, while he was left in the outs during the Sophie vote, I think he regrouped relatively well. I mean, considering he previously talked about aligning with Sandra back in episode 3, it isn't too surprising that he chose to stick with her split vote plan at the most recent tribal. But at the end of the day, again, I don't see him as a top contender. I think he has a similar problem to Michelle in that he'll be perceived as being too loyal to Sandra at the swap, especially if they end up on the same tribe together. And of course, there's still always the aspect of him being a physical threat. Obviously, I don't think he has too much prospects beyond the merge. However, I think he's gotten a bit more content aside from his allegiance to Sandra. I mean, obviously, that was a big storyline in episode 3 and probably explains why he stuck with Sandra at this most recent tribal. However, I think his content has been a bit more diverse than Michelle's, where obviously we see him aligned with the alpha males, and we get some insight into his relationship with Shael, which I think could be important later. But at the end of the day, I don't think he's winning the game, and because of that, I have him here number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and I believe we have the biggest drop off from last week's power rankings to this week's. And here we have David. And I was wrong about David. I thought he might have gotten this storyline of him getting revenge for Brianna. However, I think this week has clearly demonstrated that's not going to be that important. I mean, in episode 4, he's shown on the bottom after blowing up his game at the last tribal. He has a confessional about how he got paranoid there, played his idol and blew everything up. He's determined to rebuild trust with everyone. Like, and we see him talking to them and apologizing, especially to Sam. Even so, Sam is still determined to keep the target on his back, which isn't great. He's obviously being targeted by Sophie's alliance and gets a confessional about how no one is talking to him. He talks to Croc about how he's a physical asset, but ultimately, again, while he's shown that bit, I feel like he isn't given enough credit for saving himself. I mean, we I feel like we get most of it from Amy and Jay. Obviously, this episode establishes their close bond together. And obviously, I feel like they're doing most of the work to save David at the tribal. Obviously, we see Sam and Jesse being swing votes instead. I feel like David doesn't get that much credit for saving himself, which is not great. In episode 5, Sam says he's in our alliance, but aside from that, nothing there. And in episode 6, Sandra is targeting him for going against him, but Amy's determined to save him and even talks to him about it. He talks to Croc about targeting Sandra. And I feel like through this week, obviously, we learned that he had obviously his core of Amy and Jay, but also we see him talking to Croc a bit to where I think they have some rapport there. But overall, like I was pretty disappointed in David's edit this week. I mean, again, while we learn more about his relationships, I mean, David himself has been largely quiet. I feel like he is someone who is continuing to be targeted. However, he's not getting credit for saving himself, which is not what you want in a winner. And also, the revenge storyline doesn't really matter at this point. It feels like it was just something presented in episode 3 in order to explain David's downfall. Yeah, and like I said, gameplay wise, he's still looked at as an easy target. It's largely due to there being other threats in the game that he hasn't been actually voted out. And I'll give him some credit for building his relationships to where people want to save him. I'm not sure how he'll fit in at the swap. I could very well see him being an easy target there, especially if this cast is willing to cut the singles over people with partners still in the game. Obviously, with him being the only person that's a singles that's still in the game, that's not particularly great. And I feel like it's not looking great for David at this point. And because of that, I am here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we're going from one of the biggest drop offs from week one to one of the bigger skyrockets compared to week one, but still not super high. And here we have Jordan. And it was weird because Jordan got this weird visibility spike this week where obviously in episode 4, Sophie says he's one of her best friends. We learned that he's part of this alpha male alliance. He tells Sophie he's voting for David at the next tribal. He and his alliance agree David should go, but obviously they're blindsided at the next tribal. In episode 5, he gets a confessional about how the Sophie blindside put him on the outs. He then explains how he, Ben, and Croc need to regroup and create a new alliance. He and Croc talk to Sandra a bit. Like, obviously, Sandra tells them that they need the numbers and they need to work on building relationships. He then explains his goal to distance himself from Sophie and move forward. But obviously, that kind of blows up in his face where Sophie confronts him at the reward for quote unquote sleeping with the enemy. Now, obviously, he tells her he's trying to cover himself now that they're on different tribes trying to blow up his game. But I find it weird how obviously this is a bad move for Sophie, and we'll be talking about that later. But so weird that out of all people, she chose specifically to confront Jordan. Now, possible he talked to the others, Ben and Croc, but so weird how the show presented her deal with Jordan, despite that not seeming like a that significant of a relationship earlier on. And then in episode 6, Amy talks to him about targeting Sandra. He later talks to Croc and Ben about it. After Sandra proposes a split vote plan, he gets a confessional weighing his options. He considers Amy a good friend, which prompts him to ask her if she has an idol, which obviously after she confirms, he tells her to play it, but kind of leaves it there. And then ultimately, he sticks with Sandra's split vote plan, votes out Jay that way. So overall, this was a very interesting week for Jordan, where he went from being very invisible in the edit to having a bit more of a presence. I mean, we saw him get more involved with the alpha male contingent that gets blindsided, gets a decent amount of content in episode 5, with him reacting to the Sophie blindside and Sophie confronting him. And in episode 6, we learn he has a clearly a decent relationship with Amy, as he tells her to play the idol. Now, whether he simply did that to flush it is unclear, but they clearly have some rapport there. So it was all right for him. However, I think a lot of his screen time can't came because he was necessary to the story. I mean, he got screen time in episode 5 because Sophie confronts him. And that's something I feel like furthers Sophie's edit as a villainous loose cannon more so than Jordan's edit. I feel like the main reason we saw him tell Amy to play her idol was to create some suspense and confusion before tribal, but still, I find it interesting that he's gotten a consistent presence this week. Now, I don't know how much it'll really lead to. I feel like we don't know much about him as a person outside of his relationships. However, it is something I have noted as obviously the big reason he's jumped up on this power ranking. However, I still don't think he's going to win the game. I mean, I feel like even if he sticks with his alpha male group, they're probably going to be targeted at some point. I don't really see how he gets towards the end of the game as a result. So because of that, I'm here number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13. And again, I talked about how this person seems to be good gameplay wise. However, position wise, they may be a bit more shaky. And obviously, even then, they didn't get that much content this week. And here we have Jordy. Now, Jordy's weird. I mean, because I've mentioned before how people have talked about how they're close to him, but we don't really see that much from him himself. And I feel like this week is kind of more of the same. I mean, episode 4, Khan says he's close to him. Episode 5, his alliance talks about the vote and he throws out Sophie. Mark and the others agree, which isn't great for him gameplay wise. I mean, in episode 6, Khan talks to him about Josh about targeting Sophie. After the reward challenge, he gets a confessional talking about the reward, and then obviously he wins immunity as well, so we don't see much from him there. Overall, like I said, it's a bit more from him this week, although not nearly enough. We got further confirmation that he's in a solid position on his tribe. Up to this point, it appears he's been more loyal to Khan, and had the tribal actually gone to a vote, there seemed to be a real chance he could have been blindsided there, or at least his group. Again, obviously that's not great, but I feel like he definitely is well liked enough to where he probably could have regrouped from there. But ultimately, I don't think much about his win equity. He should make the merge given his decent social game, but I wouldn't be surprised he was taken out for being a threat later on. Or maybe if he does stick with Khan, he could still be sniped out of the game that way. But I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence about his game position, but I feel like his social game would be good enough to where if a blindside were to happen, he could probably regroup from there. So because of that, I'm here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and obviously this person got a pretty big spike in episode 5, although you can argue that was definitely circumstantial, and here we have KJ. And like I said, I mean, this was an interesting week for KJ gameplay-wise, although I feel like the edit didn't quite capitalize on that. I mean, episode 4, Mark talks to her about flushing Khan's idol, which he agrees to as Khan is dangerous. Episode 5 is where we get quite the spike for her, where obviously, she gets a confessional of her reacting to the Sophie blindside and how blood versus water causes everyone to play the game emotionally. She has to analyze the implications of having Sophie on her tribe. She feels like they're playing different games. Obviously, we see her later talk to Chrissy about the blindside and how she's worried that Sophie being on the tribe would put a target on her back, which isn't unreasonable. I mean, she's happy to have Sophie around, but is worried she'll blow up her game. At the reward, she and Chrissy watch Sophie confront Jordan. She says that she told Sophie to remain calm, but obviously is not listening. She's worried that all this could blow up her game, but Chrissy's by her side. In confessional, she says Sophie tends to be bold and hungry for revenge. After the challenge, she knows that most of her tribe is going for Sophie, but we really see her fight for Sophie here. Like, she really convinces people to blindside Khan, who obviously is a big threat, is this leader figure for the tribe and obviously has an idol in his pocket. We see her do a lot of the work to make Khan feel comfortable while getting the numbers for the blindside to happen. And while it seems like would have come through, it obviously amounts to nothing when Alex quits the game. And obviously nothing in episode 6. Overall, this was definitely a better week for KJ, but even then, I feel like a lot of her content was circumstantial, where obviously after episode 4, I was really hoping KJ would start to get this storyline of her reuniting with Sophie, and obviously with her being a super fan and Sophie not, maybe she teaches her Sophie how to play Survivor, and through that, Sophie grows to be a better player as a result. And obviously, they could become a power duo where maybe Sophie has like the social skill and the leadership ability to get the numbers, while KJ is more the strategic mastermind, like who knows the game and knows what the best move is. I was hoping we might get something like that, and it's not impossible for that to still happen. However, I feel like a lot of episode 5, the episode where she gets this spike in content, was dedicated to KJ sort of reacting to Sophie's terrible gameplay and her being worried how this could all blow up her game. none of that's particularly great for really either of them. I mean, gameplay wise, we see she has a good bond with Chrissy, and she seems aware enough about what Sophie on her tribe means for her game. And obviously, we see her convince a lot of the people to support the calm blindside at this point, which I think is somewhat impressive. But at this point, I'm not too confident about KJ winning the game. I mean, I think there's still potential for her to get a storyline moving forward, but I feel like this week just did not show much promise of that going there. So because of that, I have them here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we have someone I mentioned not too long ago, and here we have Khan. And obviously, Khan is a big character in the season. I mean, and we got plenty of him from this week, where obviously in episode 4, he has a confessional about how everyone's calm after having a night off in Tribal. He recaps how he and David found an idol and how they have a signal to give each other about whether they played theirs or not. Obviously, we see that play out at the reward challenge. He thinks everyone can trust him after he told him about his idol. He mentions his bonds to Chrissy, Jordy, Josh, and Mark, and how that places him at the top of the tribe. But then we see Mark picking up on his game. Not too great there. In episode 5, we see him hanging out with Chrissy. At the reward, we see him reunite with Amy. After the challenge, he says in confessional he wants Sophie to go. He shares this with Josh and Chrissy, tells them he has Jordy, Mark, and Nina on their side. He also mentions in the confessional his public idol and that he wouldn't want it to go to waste. He feels like voting out Sophie would allow him to keep the idol, but then later we see him picking up on others communicating without him, making him paranoid. He pulls Shael aside, who certainly tries to calm him down. And while it seems like he would have been blindsided at this tribal, he's spared when Alex quits the game, so not particularly great there. In episode 6, Sophie talks to him about them being an unexpected alliance. You know, she makes that proposal to him. However, he clearly rejects it as she and KJ were the same people that tried flushing his idol at the last tribal. Not great. He knows Sophie's at the bottom. He relays this information to Josh and Jordy, and they agree that Sophie needs to go next. He also talks to Mark about it, which he agrees to. Khan feels like he has a lot of control at the moment, and all of this just feels like overconfidence in my opinion. So overall, I mean, Khan, like I said, another big week in terms of screen time, and I feel like he is turning out how I expected him to. Episode 5 laid out so much groundwork for a potential blindside, and now that we're getting to a swap, I feel like he's primed to be taken out relatively soon. Now, to his credit, he seems to at least somewhat aware of stuff that's happening around him. We saw him start to pick up on the blind side, and we saw him like try to scramble to see if he could figure it out. So even then, it's not a guarantee whether he would have been voted out or whether he would have played as idle, but still not that great of a position to be in. And now we're seeing him want to target Sophie, and who knows whether that storyline will carry into the swap. You know, like there's stuff going for him, but I still feel like Khan is someone who is being set up for a downfall. Now, whether that comes at the swap or relatively soon, I feel like it will be coming soon. And through that, I don't think he's going to win. However, the reason he's above the people we just mentioned is that he has at least gotten the screen time. He's at least gotten the consistent showing of his game to where I wouldn't be surprised if he makes it relatively further than some people might expect. But still, I feel like he is being set for a downfall at some point, probably not winning the game. And because of that, I have him here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10. And like Khan, we have another pretty prominent character on the season, and that is Sandra. Now, I've already talked about Sandra quite a bit, and obviously, this is another big week for her, which means we have a bit more to talk about. So, in episode 4, obviously, she recaps the previous tribal and talks about how David blew up his game. She talks to Amy and Michelle about David. And obviously, after the war challenge, she asks Shael how Nia's doing, which she says she's doing well. She's repeatedly shown contrasted to Sophie and her group, which obviously is foreshadowing for Sandra talking about Sophie lacking self awareness and how she needs to break up this grouping of her and the alpha males. You know, like, while David remains an easy target, she has her eyes on Sophie. And obviously, we see that being enacted where she gets Michelle on her side, she gets Amy on her side. What through that gets Jay and David on her side as well, and obviously that leaves Sam and Jesse as the swing votes, but obviously in the end they sided with her. Sophie is blindsided. In episode 5, of course, we learned that Sophie is still in the game. She talks about how it was a surprise for her, even though it should have been kind of obvious, but whatever. Sam explains that she's in her alliance. Croc and Jordan talk to her about the game and how they need to work on building new relationships. And in episode 6, she calls life at the Blood Tribe pretty good. She speculates that Sophie was voted out at the last tribal, but obviously is proven wrong there. She talks about how she's lasted 2 weeks in the game before getting this really personal segment, not really an intro package, but this really personal segment about how Survivor shaped her life and how it's obviously put Nina through college, how it's really built her life, and how she's currently on day 13. But obviously, day 16, she's cursed because she was voted out of Game Changers and Winners of War both on day 16, and how she's really determined to get past that hump. But then obviously we see her targeting Dave, which then leads to Amy wanting to turn on her. We see Amy do a lot of work to blindside Sandra, particularly by trying to get those alpha males on her side. And we really see Sandra like come out during this, where obviously she really picks up on Amy and this trio doing that. She decides to target them. Michelle tells her about Amy's idol, which causes her to split the vote with Amy and Jay. And then obviously, Amy plays the idol on herself, but obviously, the split plan vote works and Jay is voted out. A lot to talk about there. And overall, Sandra continues to be a major presence on the show. Admittedly, I haven't weighed that too heavily as I feel like she was always going to be a big confessional getter, even if she was an early boot. Even so, I've liked how much strategic content she's been getting. Granted, it isn't the best look that she assumes David was the one to write her name down when we know that isn't true, but we understand her thinking pretty well. In gameplay wise, while she has been in a decent amount of danger due to her threat level, I've been impressed by how she's managed to maneuver the game. I mean, we've seen her position herself in the middle of the alpha males in her core of Sam and Michelle. And despite some people recognizing how big of a threat she is, we hear plenty of people show deference and respect to her, and now it appears she'll be coming to the swap with Nina on the same tribe, which should be good for her as well. But as I stated before, I don't think Sandra will win. I feel like there are too many people that talked about targeting her. I mean, we've heard Nina talk about it, we've heard Sam talk about it, we've heard people like Amy talk about it as well, and even Jesse's talked about it to a degree. And while we're seeing people like Ben, Croc, and Michelle being open to working with her, there will come a point where even they think it's no longer worth it to keep such a massive target in the game. So because of that, I don't think Sandra will win. Mind you, I think she could definitely get further. I mean, I think she could definitely work with some people in the short term, but I think there will come a point where she'll be cut. So because of that, I have her here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we literally have the daughter of the person I just talked about. We have Nina. And this was definitely a down week for Nina. I mean, no content in episode 4. Episode 5, Sophie tells her that while Sandra wasn't behind her blind side, she thinks she's inspired others to pull off a big move. And then no content in episode 6. I mean, overall, none of this is particularly great. Now, to be fair, she is on the water tribe, so a drop off isn't too bad at the end of the day, but admittedly, at the time of the premiere, while I was pretty high on her, I started to wonder whether a lot of this was circumstantial or not. Now, I didn't want to jump into any conclusions at that time so soon in the season, but it was something I considered. And I feel like as more time passes, it does appear to be the case. I mean, we haven't really gotten much checkup from her since episode 1, really. Now, the main upside for to her is that she will be reunited with Sandra at the swap. That was made clear in the promo. And I feel like that will be a potential setup for a storyline. Maybe Nina is the one to blindside Sandra, or maybe she's blindsided herself. I mean, there's definitely potential for Nina to grow within the game. And I feel like as more people talk about like Sandra being a threat and getting her out at some point, I feel like Nina could have a hand to play in that. But at the end of the day, I'm no longer super confident she'll win the game. I feel like other people have clearly jumped up in my winner contention. So because of that, I have her here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have someone who's jumped up a decent amount from last week. And while I don't think they're going to win, I'm impressed by their edit this week. So here we have Croc at number 8. And like I said, I feel like he's gotten a bit more content this week. In episode 4, Sophie says he's one of her best friends. He and his alliance agreed David should go. David approaches him and proposes saving him. But obviously, he gets blindsided at the end of that episode. In episode 5, he confers with Jordan and Ben about being on the outs. And then in episode 6, we get a confessional about him being on the bottom and how they should consider working with Sandra. However, there are some trust issues with Sandra. And then through that, we get an individual intro package, which kind of came out of left field. But obviously, we learned more about Croc, talking about his rugby career and how he came on to Survivor to rediscover his purpose. And I thought that was very positive for him. And considering, like, again, he wasn't in any danger in this episode, and even still, like, wasn't super involved in the action happening here. The fact that we got that anyway was a bit of a positive sign. David talks to him afterwards about targeting Sandra. He gets a confessional about how he's a swing vote and has multiple options. Talks to Ben and Jordan about it. And before Tribal, Jay and Croc assure each other they'll let each other know what's happening. However, he sticks with Sandra's split vote plan, and through that, Jay gets voted out. So a bit of a deception going on from Croc's end. Overall, this was a better week for Croc. I mean, episode 6 was particularly strong for him, where obviously he gets that individual intro package seemingly out of nowhere. And while he was on the outs for the Sophie vote, his relationship with Sandra allowed him to get back into a swing vote position at this latest tribal. And ultimately, I think he made the right decision in keeping Sandra over Amy or Jay, who aren't particularly loyal to him. Again, I don't see him as a top contender, but this was still a good week for him, and I'll be interested to see how he manages during the swap with Chrissy around. So because of that, I have him here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have someone I just mentioned. It is Chrissy. Now, obviously, this was a relatively quiet week for her after getting such a big presence in the first week. I feel like this was definitely more of a cool down period for her. I mean, episode 4, Khan says he's close to her. Episode 5, we see her hanging out with Khan. At the reward, she and KJ watch as Sophie blows up at Jordan. Obviously, she talks to KJ there. After the challenge, she agrees to the calm blindside, it seems, but obviously doesn't really amount to anything. And then no content in episode 6. So, overall, like I said, this was a quiet week for Chrissy, which is partially expected as the Water Tribe didn't vote anyone out. She's been close to Khan, although episode 5 implied she was open to blindsiding him. In any case, I expect her to have a bounce back, especially if she reunites with Croc at the swap. And I still expect her to be a big character moving forward. But like I said, I don't view her as a top contender. And even beyond that, I don't think she did much to make me think she's a great player either. So because of that, I have her here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and admittedly, I'm higher on this person than a lot of other people. I mean, and he's not really a big character, but I feel like he has a lot of potential to be. And here we have Jesse, and Jesse's been interesting. I mean, like I said, he hasn't gotten the biggest edit in the world, but I feel like there's enough there to where I feel like he'll be a big player moving forward. I mean, episode 4, Sophie pitches a David plan to him, and he seems to agree with that. Later on, Amy approaches him, and Sam that there are numbers to blindside Sophie, prompting them to go off and talk separately. We see them being the swing votes there. Obviously, Sam tells him the move would be dangerous as they would be viewed as the flippers. However, he appears more open to the plan, saying that doing nothing would put them on the bottom. And ultimately, he votes for Sophie, which I think is the correct decision for him, as we see later on that while Sophie is mad at a lot of people, we never see her being mad at him. Obviously, that's something there. Episode 5, literally says he's in her alliance, and it seems like he's definitely one of her closer allies in the game. But aside from that, no content really. And then episode 6, like I said, not too much content, although he gets this random segment at the very beginning of the episode, gets a confessional about bringing fun to the tribe. We see people laughing at him. He enjoys being known as the baby of the tribe and is all right being underestimated for now. And then ultimately, he talks about how this will allow him to make big moves later. And like I said, this scene comes completely out of nowhere. It's just like thrown in at the beginning of the episode, like literally before the theme song even plays. So that coupled with what we saw in week 1 makes me think he probably will be a big player moving forward. Overall, like I said, some moderate spikes here. We've gotten more coverage of his relationship with Sam and the two of them being close. Like I said, was a swing vote there. While we see Sophie turn on people she was loyal to before, Jesse hasn't got much blowback himself, literally what I just said. And like I said, I think there's a lot of potential for Jesse moving forward. Like Amy, I discussed last week how he has that potential of being this big player. He's shown being aware. And while he hasn't gotten the biggest presence in the world, he's gotten a relatively consistent presence, I feel like. And I feel like he will have a hand in Sandra's eventual downfall. He's one of these people that talked about wanting to get rid of Sandra at some point. I think that's definitely a boon for him, and wouldn't be surprised if he was one of the main orchestrators of that move. But for now, I have him here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we literally have someone I just mentioned, and here we have Amy. And like I said, Amy got a pretty big week in terms of content. I mean, to recap, in episode 4, Sandra approaches her about the Sophie plan. She has a confessional about voting out Sophie, how it would be good for her game due to Sophie being a social threat. She insists she's not falling for Sophie's manipulation, tells Sandra she's working with Jay, who's able to influence David. Even so, Sandra wants her to be the face of the Sophie blindside, which would cause her to get blamed for it, which isn't the best look in the world, but it's something, I guess. She talks to Jay about how she likes David and doesn't want him to go. She then pitches uh, the Sophie blindside to him, which he agrees to. She then talks about flipping Sam and Jesse, but given that Sam is close to Sophie, it'll be hard. She talks to Sam and Jesse and explains the numbers are there to blindside Sophie, and obviously, the plan goes through. Episode 5, Sam says he's in our alliance. At the reward, we see her reunite with Khan, and not much aside from that. And obviously, episode 6 was another big episode for her, where obviously we see Sandra start to turn on them. Amy, uh, like when Sandra asks Amy who she wants to target, she specifically says not David, which causes Sandra to want to target her trio of her, Jay, and David. Obviously, a lot happens there. She finds an idol. Uh, Plans to blindside Sandra, but then obviously Sandra catches wind of it, which causes her to split the vote. But then Jordan tells her to play her idol for herself, does that, but then loses Jay to the split vote plan. So obviously a lot happens with her this week, and it wasn't the best week for Amy gameplay wise, with her getting on Sandra's radar for targeting her. While I don't entirely blame her for wanting to take that shot, she obviously didn't have the strongest bonds with the alpha males, which obviously made it tough for her to get their numbers. Losing Jay isn't ideal either, and if she gets swapped with Sandra, I could see her being a target. On the other hand, if she swapped with Khan, Jordan, David, or possibly Sophie, I think there are opportunities for her. Now, edit wise, I talked about last week how Amy had the potential to get a visibility spike despite a quiet start. She ended up getting that this week, but the question is how much it really helps her. Now, last week, I mentioned that the biggest potential storyline for her was her stepping out of Khan's shadow. And while that wasn't alluded to directly, I don't think it's impossible for that to happen. Khan had a big week as well, but also got set up for an eventual downfall. Amy, on the other hand, hasn't been as prominent as Khan. It still has quite a bit of negativity to her edit. But there's still that potential for her to become a bigger player moving forward, and I'd be very curious to see if that ends up happening. But for now, while she's definitely one of the higher people on my radar, I feel like number 5 is about as high as I can put her, given her negativity and her relatively poor game position for the time being. Now moving on to number 4, and I'm sure some people will probably have this person considerably lower after this week's episodes. And to be fair, I considered putting her lower than what she is now. However, I feel like while she played the game pretty terribly this week, I feel like Sophie is someone who probably in it for the long haul at this point. Yes, this was a very bad week for her. Episode 4, she asked Shael to tell KJ she said hi. She then talks to Shael and Sophie about the dynamics on the Blood Tribe. She says she's close to Croc, Jordan, Ben, and Sam. In confessionals, she calls herself a natural leader, and it's uncommon for her to not give directions. This will be a challenge for her, but she's watering it down, even as we see examples of her giving directions. And then obviously, we have Sandra start to target her. Obviously, she gets blindsided 7-4, which is very bad. Sandra even calls her a rookie, making rookie mistakes, how she lacks self awareness, which none of that's particularly great. Obviously, she's voted out 7-4. However, it is a non-elimination episode, and she's sent to the Water Tribe. And then in episode 5, you would think that she would get this redemption arc, especially after she's reunited with KJ, who knows a lot more about the game than her. Maybe get that storyline about KJ teaching Sophie how to play Survivor. However, we don't get that at all. I mean, at this point, it largely turns into a revenge story for Sophie. She talks about her blind side with people. She tells Mark that while she doesn't think Sam thought that she was at the bottom when she really wasn't. She asserts again, she'll have a say of what happens at the Water Tribe and how she'll take it out on the family members of the people that voted her out, which isn't great. She looks forward to confronting the Blood Tribe after the reward challenge, and we see that where she gets very confrontational. She gets upset at Jordan, Ben, and Croc for not even speaking to her, as if they're trying to distance themselves from her, which isn't a great look. I mean, these are literally the people that voted to save her, and she doesn't seem to understand that there's no point in them trying to act like they're so aligned at this point, especially when it's possible they could get targeted. She particularly confronts Jordan about sleeping with the enemy. Jordan tells her he's trying to stay quiet, but she doesn't seem to get it. She digs deeper, almost acting as if she sees Jordan as a bigger enemy than the people that voted her out, which is just dumb. She also talks to Sam and demands to know why she betrayed her after showing so much loyalty. After the challenge, she's the initial target. However, we see KJ introduce a split vote plan to blindside Khan. She gets a confessional about how her sister is working hard to protect her, and I'm not particularly fond about this. I mean, it's not great that Sophie doesn't get more credit for trying to save herself. It seems like KJ gets the bulk of the credit anyway. However, it doesn't really matter as Alice quits the game, so there's that. And then in episode 6, she calls herself the Wicked Witch of the tribe and how she can't be killed, even though I don't know. I mean, sort of implies that Khan would have plays it his idol, but whatever. She knows she's at the bottom. It's a double-edged sword for her to be on the same tribe as KJ. She recognizes that. She then floats the idea of working with Khan despite him being a threat. However, we see Khan immediately reject this and how he plans to target her moving forward. However, they win the challenge and we know a swap is coming, so it doesn't matter too much. Overall, like I said, this was a big week for Sophie, and gameplay wise, it was very bad for her. Where obviously she made herself too big of a target by aligning with the alpha males, which caused Sandra to blindside her. Sandra calls her a rookie and doesn't understand the game. And then, even after being blindsided, we see her pretty much become pretty emotional as a result of this blindside. Like, she doesn't handle it well. The way she handles people like Sam and Jordan was pretty bad. And hearing KJ talk about how Sophie is more of a liability is pretty bad as well. So a lot of bad stuff from Sophie, both edit wise and gameplay wise. So with all that said, why is she at number 4? Well, I think the main reason is that while yes, she's playing pretty poorly right now, I think she's gonna be a big character moving forward. I think the show is investing quite a bit of energy into showing her flaws on the screen, and I wouldn't be surprised if through that she survives at least until right before the merge, potentially, or even further than that. I mean, I don't think she'll necessarily be the next boot given how big of a presence she's had. And given that this is Australian Survivor, I feel like that puts her at least in the same ballpark as Khan and Sandra in that regard. It's just a matter of how far she can get as a result, and I wouldn't be surprised if the show is setting her out to be this villain character moving forward. And obviously, if that's the case, then she's probably in it for the long haul. But at the end of the day, she's probably not going to win, if I'm being perfectly honest. I mean, again, the way she's playing has been very erratic, very emotional. And I feel like she hasn't really learned a lot of her mistakes that caused her to get blindsided the first time. I think she might start to calm down a bit after the swap. However, I feel like if they're continuing her down this villain route, then I feel like she'll probably be in it for a while, even if she doesn't win at the end, which is more than I can say for a lot of other people that we've already talked about. So, because of that, despite her sucking this week, I actually have her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this was someone who definitely had a quieter week, but I still feel relatively confident about them. It was actually the person I had at number 1 last week. It is Shael. And like I said, this was definitely a quieter week for Shael. I mean, in episode 4, Mark tells her about flushing Khan's idol. After Blood wins the reward challenge, they choose her to go over and enjoy with them. Obviously, there we see her reuniting with her partner Ben, but also talks to a lot of the tribe, which is pretty good. talks to Jesse about how funny his brother Jordy is, tells Sandra that Nina's doing well, tells Sam that Mark is doing well. And obviously, Sophie then reveals she's close to Croc, Jordan, Ben, and Sam to Shael, and that she could go back and tell this to Chrissy, Josh, and Mark. Episode 5, we see her reunite with Ben again at the reward. After the challenge, she talks in confessional about how grueling it was. While she was initially on board without Sophie, she agrees to KJ's proposal to blindside Khan, offers herself as a pawn for a split vote, but also as an idol, which he plans on plating. As Khan gets more paranoid, he pulls her aside. She gets to talk about keeping him calm and confessional. And no content in episode 6, but again, they don't go to tribal, so that's kind of whatever. This was definitely a quieter week for Shael, and while she hasn't been the most vocal person ever, even in week 1, I felt like that she would have this spike similar to Haley, where obviously Haley had a bad week too, could definitely get more content moving forward. And I still feel like she'll be a major player in the season. I mean, she seems to be in a decent position gameplay wise, and I feel like she's definitely someone who will probably do relatively well at the end of the day. But the reason I have her a bit lower on this list isn't because of anything bad about her edit, but it's more so I feel like the top two people we'll be talking about have just jumped up for me. And obviously they were already top contenders, but they have become such clear frontrunners to me that I don't realistically see Shael winning at this point, if I'm being perfectly honest. But I feel like if it isn't this top two, then I feel like she's the next most likely option. And I feel like because of that, I have her here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and straight up, I'm just gonna say this up front. I feel very confident that one of these two people are gonna win this season. And while I feel more confident in my number 1 pick, I feel like if that person doesn't win, this person is easily the next highest likely winner of these two. So at number 2, we have Sam. And I feel like Sam has continued to get a consistent presence on the show. I mean, episode 4 has a confessional about how David revealed her game at the previous tribal. She's shown talking to Sophie as well as Jordan and Jesse. Her goal now is to keep the target on David, but obviously later on, we see at the reward challenge, she gets a confessional about bringing Shael over with the hope of gathering information about the other tribe. She asks Shael how Mark's doing, with Shael saying she's doing well. She explained in the confessional that she didn't want to bring over Mark as she didn't want to jeopardize his game by being separated from his tribe, and how she needs to play her game and Mark needs to play his game so that they can get to the merge together. And that right there solidified her as easily number 2 on the list. Is that we now have this storyline of Mark and Sam getting to the merge together. It was established in the premiere, and now we're getting it again. And with both of them getting this consistent content throughout the season, this winner edit caliber content, I feel like that only solidifies the fact that they're going to get to merge together. And through that, they'll possibly be able to run the game together. So obviously, that storyline getting solidified is great. Sophie says she's very close to her, but obviously later on, Sam is a part of the blind side, where obviously she's a pros and her and Jesse are the swing votes there. Sam is very concerned about being perceived as flippers and being put at the bottom, but obviously she goes through with it at the end, which is a tough decision for her. I mean, obviously, we see Sophie was very loyal to her. And obviously, we see in the next episode that Sophie takes it personally against Sam. However, obviously, most of the tribes seem to already be against Sophie, so there wasn't too much she could do. So I could take or leave that actual decision. In episode 5, she recaps the previous tribal and how Sophie specifically blamed her for the blind side, again, continuing that storyline. She feels like Sophie will play the victim at the Wire tribe, which is largely true, I feel like. So it's important to tell her they need to vote her out. She explains how the tribe is divided into two groups. There's her side with herself, Sandra, Amy, Jay, Jesse, Michelle, and David, with the alpha males kind of on the outs. She also explains that voting out Sophie would destabilize the alpha male alliance, which it's kind of true, although obviously they're also close to Sandra, so they're able to get roped back in afterwards. At the reward, we see her reunite with Mark, and it's such a big moment there. Sophie then pulls her aside and lays it all out. Gets a confessional about how she needs to deal with Sophie because she's all consuming. Merely reinforces the fact that Sophie is a source of drama. And obviously, after that, We don't get too much. I mean, she talks to Josh and Jordan about Sophie and gives them permission to target her. Obviously, she's playing that seed there. And then in episode 6, Sandra targets David for going after her at the first tribal and thinks he wrote her name down. But actually, it was Sam that wrote down Sandra's name. And I thought that was another positive sign for her that Sandra doesn't even suspect that Sam targeted her. I thought that was a positive there. After the challenge, Sandra mentions that Sam is close to Jesse, again, sticking with that. And like I said, this was a pretty good week for Sam. Sticks with a Sandra split vote plan, gets out Jay that way. And I just feel like Sam has continued to get the strong edit. She got a pretty good week 1, but obviously here we get number of stuff from her. We know she's aligned with Sandra, but she's also close to Jesse. Her relationships are pretty well defined. There's obviously her bond with Mark, and this week expanded upon the storyline that they have to get to the merge together. At this point, I feel like that's exactly what will happen. But beyond that, we also know her relationship with Jesse. And in episode 5, while we see Sophie confront her, Sophie is portrayed pretty negatively. Gameplay wise, Sam remains in a pretty good position. I mean, while voting out Sophie wasn't ideal for her, I already talked about that, how there wasn't too much Sam could have done either way. I just feel like Sam will continue to do well in the game. I feel like she has a number of allies who obviously have been getting pretty big edits as well. And through that, I feel like Sam is probably in it for the long haul. And if she can get to the merge with Mark, she'll probably be in a good position to dominate the game. And I actually think that if Mark isn't the one to win the game, then Sam is the next most likely person. I feel like a lot of her relationships are pretty well defined as well. I feel like there's so much going for Sam to where she's very high on my winner contention. I feel like unless we get some pretty significant evidence to the contrary, I feel like Sam will continue to be a top contender for me moving forward. However, there's one other person I think has her number and is probably more likely to win than her. So because of that, I have her here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I think is the most likely to win Australian Survivor Blood versus Water is Mark. And come on, how can it not be Mark at this point? I mean, we'll talk about that more in a minute, but if we're looking at his content, it's been so strong up to this point. I mean, he was already a top contender for me in week 1. I feel like this week just solidified him in the top spot for me. I mean, episode 4, we know Khan is close to him. He has a confessional about how his intelligence experience taught him about psychology. He's noticing how Khan is running the tribe. He's very social and disarms people with his charm. That, coupled with his idol, makes Khan dangerous. He talks to Josh, KJ, and Shael about possibly flushing Khan's idol if they go back to tribal, and we see the rest of them agree that Khan's a dangerous player. He then discloses to them his alliance with Khan and how he's going to use that to make Khan feel safe. In episode 5, Sophie tells him that Sam flipped because she thought she was at the bottom, but assures him that she wasn't at the bottom. After the reward challenge, he gets a confessional about winning the reward and spending time with the other tribe. Sure enough, we see him reunite with Sam. In confessional, he talks about missing Sam and what seeing her again means. She even pulls out a picture of their child, really hammering this home. After the immunity challenge, he says in confessional that Sophie needs to go. But aside from that, we don't see too much from him. I mean, it's even implied that he's open to blindsided Khan as we saw in previous episodes. In episode 6, he talks to KJ about how the previous tribal felt like a waste. Khan talks to him about targeting Sophie, and he seems open to it. He gets a confessional about winning the reward challenge and how they're beneficial for him. After having some food at the reward, he gets another confessional about how it gives him the ability to think about the game. He knows they've considered getting rid of Khan with the idol, but it's risky. But the other option is Sophie, which he seems to be leaning towards at the moment. He's making sure Sophie doesn't get an idol clue out the reward and flips over the table for some reason. And that's sort of how the scene ends. Doesn't really elaborate on that. I thought that was kind of weird. But overall, how can Mark not be the front runner at this point? Gameplay wise, he is the center of the tribe, very well positioned. He's essentially the leader figure for the water tribe, but nobody sees him as a threat. Khan has taken most of the heat from that. Even then, Khan trusts Mark very closely, which is good for his game. On top of that, his edit has been so strong. I mean, all 3 episodes this week went out of their way to give Mark at least some content. and that content felt significant. We're constantly hearing his thoughts on the game, and he's shown being observant and correct. And unlike people like Sandra or Khan, who we also hear a lot of game from, it's not overbearing, which really makes him even more of a frontrunner. But even beyond that, you have the storyline of him and Sam and how important it is for them to make it to the merge together. And I talked about this with Sam a moment ago, but I feel so confident they will get to the merge together. And at that point, they'll probably run the game. Now, again, I noted a lot of this in week one. I felt like Mark was already a top contender then, but I think the main reason that kept him from number one last week was the fact that he was a returning player. And I wondered how much of that was simply due to the storyline of Mark and Sam playing again. But I think this week just solidified to me that this is going to be a major storyline in the season. And I feel like Mark has been propped up over and over again without it seeming too obvious, but in turn making it more obvious. And I feel like now with the swap coming, he's going to really skyrocket and really take over the game at this point. Again, I feel like he's good gameplay wise. I feel like he's good edit wise. And if he doesn't win the season at this point, I would be very surprised, but for now, I feel like Mark is the most likely person to win Australian Survivor Blood versus Water. And there we go. That will do it for this week's Power Rankings for Australian Survivor. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. I'll be back again next week to update these Power Rankings once again. I'm still covering Amazing Race as well as Celebrity Big Brother. I'll probably adjust the upload schedule for the short term to reflect the fact that Australian Survivor is on the Sunday, Monday, Tuesday schedule now. So I'll probably start having these out on Wednesday, and through that, the Amazing Race videos will be out on Friday. I think the Celebrity Big Brother videos might still be out on Monday, as that's usually the night of the eviction. I feel like that's a good time to have it then. So stay tuned for all that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.